A Hero's Revenge by Remington Van Blaze. On December 7th, 1941, fighter planes from Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Like many other young men his age, Reese Bartlett of Fairmont, West Virginia, heard the call and enlisted in the Marines to go fight for his country. With pride, he walked right up to his high school sweetheart's house and knocked on the door. Susan Riddle was not only the daughter of one of the richest men in Marion County, but she was also, without a doubt, the most beautiful Reese had ever seen. Many of his friends, and even his younger brother Johnny, would often tell Reese how lucky he was to be going with such a pretty girl. Reese had planned everything right just for this moment. And when Susan answered the door, he told her that he just enlisted to go fight and that he wanted to do right by her. He dropped down on his knee right there on her front porch step and presented her a ring. He gazed up into her eyes and asked her to marry him. And with a smile so wide, her eyes lit up and she said yes. They had arranged a date to get married as soon as possible, but Reese was called to duty a lot sooner than he had predicted. He was quickly called to boot camp and then shipped off to a battlefield in Japan. But before he left, he made Susan a promise that as soon as the war was over, he would return and he would marry her and make an honest woman out of her. And then he asked her, "Do you think you can wait that long for me?" And she looked at him and she promised that she would. Many days, weeks, and months passed, and it seemed to Susan that Reese would certainly not return. And before very long, his younger brother Johnny had begun talking to her in school. Johnny was just 1 year younger than Reese, and he also attended the same high school. The two of them talked a lot, sometimes about Reese, sometimes about school. As time went on, Susan and Johnny were becoming very good friends. Johnny had found himself falling in love with Susan, and he began telling Susan lies about his brother Reese's intentions. He told her that Reese was only interested in her because her family had a lot of money. Johnny also told Susan that he was the one who really loved her and not Reese. And Johnny said he loved her for who she was as a person and not just for her body or her family's money. He confessed that he had been in love with her for a couple of years now. After many months, Johnny convinced Susan to forget about his brother, and he asked Susan to marry him. It had been years since she had seen Reese, and she too admitted she had feelings for Johnny and decided to marry him. The two of them moved into a small house in Fairmont's East Side neighborhood, where they lived a life together as a newly married couple. It seemed their life would be a typical happy ending. Then, on October 31st, 1943, Halloween night, there was a knock on the door. It was around 10:30 p.m., which was a little late for trick-or-treaters. They had many trick-or-treaters this particular night, but Johnny got up to answer the door. He looked into the bowl and noticed he still had a few pieces of candy he could give out to this last trick-or-treater. When Johnny opened the door, he got the shock of his life. It was his brother Reese, dressed in a uniform. "Hiya, Johnny, remember me? I'm home." Normally when brothers are reunited after a long time, it is assumed that they would be happy to see each other. But Johnny immediately felt cold and distant towards Reese. Johnny did not welcome Reese into his home, and Reese seemed confused, asking, "Johnny, what's wrong? Are you mad at me or something?" And Johnny answered, "Reese, you are not welcome here. You're going to want to go somewhere else." Reese looked almost startled by this and was about to ask Johnny why he was acting this way when Susan entered the room asking, "Johnny, who is that at the door you're talking to?" And when she saw who was outside on the porch, she seemed to give a little gasp. "Oh, my, Reese, what are you doing here?" Reese looked at her and then at Johnny. He began to first look puzzled and then angry, and then he asked, "Johnny, what the heck is Susan doing here? What's going on?" And then Johnny began to raise his voice. "Reese, Susan and I are married now, and you're going to have to accept this. She no longer loves you, and you are not welcome in this house." Reese looked first at Johnny in disbelief, and then over at Susan, who was refusing to meet his eyes with hers. He then turned his gaze back to his brother's face. Both men were staring at each other, neither saying a word. The silence between them seemed to linger for a long period of time. Neither man uttering as much as a breath, just staring at each other. And then Reese just snapped. He lunged at Johnny with all his might and grabbed his brother by the neck with both hands. Johnny, who had no military fighting training, was clearly no match for Reese, who had been hardened by war. Reese gripped Johnny's neck as tight as possible, and then Johnny fell back as Reese fell on top of him, with his hand still in a death grip on Johnny's neck. Susan screamed, "Reese, get off of him! You'll hurt him!" But Reese paid her no mind at all. He just kept strangling his brother. Reese then pinned Johnny's shoulders down by straddling them with his knees, and he continued to choke his brother. Soon Reese was lifting and banging his brother's head off the floor and then slamming it back down by his throat. Susan began to scream and then ran to the phone to call the police, but Reese kept up with his death grip, the same grip he had used on many Japanese soldiers in the trenches of Japan. And soon, Johnny's body fell limp, and his eyes rolled back in his head. He was breathing no more. Reese looked at his dead brother on the floor, and at that moment, Susan walked back into the room. She stared right at Reese's face and exclaimed, You killed him! You killed your own brother, you monster!" Reese got up off of his brother's body and he staggered. He looked back at Susan, and then he turned around and ran out of the house into the darkness, into the cold Halloween air. Within a few minutes, the police arrived, and Susan told them that Reese Bartlett had returned from fighting in Japan. She told police how Reese was wearing his Marine's uniform and how he had killed his own brother right there on the floor. Soon many police had shown up, as well as the coroner. Police put out a manhunt looking for Reese, but despite every police officer in town looking, they were not able to locate him. The police searched for 2 days, and the story made the headlines of the local Fairmont newspaper. War hero, kills own brother, and love triangle Halloween homicide. 3 days later, Susan heard a knock at the door. Certain this was finally going to be the police informing her that they had found Reese and that he was in jail. But when she opened the door, she got quite a surprise. Standing there was 2 men dressed in uniforms, their faces stern and emotionless. But before she could speak, one of them asked, "Is this the home of John Bartlett, the brother of Reese Bartlett?" She answered cautiously, "Yes, I'm his wife, but John passed away 5 nights ago." "Well, ma'am, I'm sorry to hear that, but I have other unfortunate news. I'm here to pass a message on to John Bartlett, that on October 15th, 1943, his brother Reese Bartlett died honorably fighting for his country."